Hi, it's Mr. Bennett, and in today's video we're going to talk about ecological succession. Now, what ecological succession is, pure and simple, is how ecosystems are formed. In our last video we talked about biomes and all the different types of ecosystems you find on the planet, from desert to taiga and so forth. What ecological succession talks about is how those ecosystems are formed and what's the process you go through in starting out with an area where you have absolutely nothing to a full functioning biome or ecosystem. Now, an ecosystem is going to be made up of two main things. It's going to be made up of biotic factors, and a biotic factor are the living things in an ecosystem. The word bio means life, so biotic factors are living factors in an ecosystem. This is going to be like plants, animals, fungi, and bacteria. And so the process of ecological succession describes how all the biotic factors come to live in an area. Now, the other thing that an ecosystem will have is it'll have abiotic factors. Anytime you see the word a in front of something, a means not. So biotic means living, so putting an a in front of it means not living. So the abiotic factors are the non-living factors in an ecosystem, things like climate, the type of soil, elevation, and air. And so when we're talking about ecological succession, we're going to be talking about biotic and abiotic factors and how they interact so that living things can come and start to live in an area. Now, there are two main types of ecological succession. So ecological succession is how you go from no living things in an area to having a forest or full functioning biome. And there are two different ways that this can happen. The first one is called primary succession, and primary succession is where you start out with bare rock and end up with a forest in the area. The second way is called secondary succession. Now, secondary succession happens when some disturbance like a fire comes and kills all the living things. Secondary succession shows how a biome or an ecosystem recovers after some big disturbance came and wiped out everything that was there. So the main types of ecological succession are primary succession and secondary succession, and we're going to talk about these in more detail. So let's start with primary succession first. So primary succession is the process of how an ecosystem forms in an area where there's no soil, like this picture here, and eventually this area with no soil will be transformed into this area here. This is Hawaii. Both of these pictures are Hawaii. And Hawaii is an example of primary succession. At one point, every last square inch of Hawaii looked like this down here. Hawaii was formed by volcano eruptions, and those volcanoes let out lava. That lava cooled and made lava rock. And every last inch of Hawaii looked like this at some point. Now you can see there's no dirt here. There's nothing to plant seeds in. Eventually, through the process of primary succession, areas like this were converted into this. How did this happen? Well, the first thing that happened is a pioneer species moves in. And a pioneer species is the first species that comes in and lives in an area. So you had rocks like this, and in would come a pioneer species. And the most common pioneer species you've all seen before, if you've paid attention, is lichen. Now, lichen is an organism that can live on bare rock. I've seen it growing on bare rock. I've even seen it growing on the plastic of the playground equipment over at Willow Park. So lichen is something that can grow in a place where there is no soil whatsoever. Now, what lichen is made of is it's an algae and a fungus that grow together. What happens is the fungus dissolves the rock and releases nutrients that the algae needs to grow. And then the algae does photosynthesis and makes the food that keeps both the algae and the fungus alive. So lichen can grow even on bare rock where there's no soil whatsoever. So lichen comes into an area like this and it starts to grow and it starts to dissolve the rock. And as it dissolves the rock, it makes just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of soil, which opens the way for other living things to come in and live there, other plants to come in and live. Well, we start out with bare rock. The lichens come in and they live first. These are our pioneer species. As the lichens dissolve the rock, they make just a little bit of soil, as you can see in this picture right here. This soil now makes it so bigger plants can grow there, things like mosses. And then as the mosses grow, they die, and the dead moss becomes a little bit thicker layer of soil, which opens it up so things like grasses can grow. As the grasses grow, they die, making a little bit thicker layer of soil, opening it up so eventually trees can live in an area. So this is the process of primary succession. We started out with bare rock, no soil whatsoever, and then as pioneer species come in and live, and then die, and then the dead pioneer species become soil, It opens the way for intermediate species, and then finally the climax community. The climax community is what an ecosystem looks like when it's no longer changing. Now, how long does this take? How long does it take to go from bare rock to a full forest ecosystem? Hundreds of years. This is slow work, but it can happen, and the Hawaiian Islands are an example of that. Let me give you another example of primary succession. Another example of primary succession happened up in Alaska, in Glacier Bay. Now what happened is Glacier Bay, this whole area used to be covered by a glacier, a big old piece of ice. Now what's happened is since the 1760s, this glacier has been slowly melting and retreating. So in the 1760s, this whole area of the bay, right here, this was all covered in ice. By the 1860s, the glacier had melted and only this area was covered in ice. By 1907, only this area was covered by ice, and then by 1941, only this area was covered by ice. Now what happened is when a glacier melts, there is no soil. Underneath the glacier is nothing but bare rock. And so as this glacier is melted, it's left bare rock, and we can see the process of primary succession. Up in this area was covered by the glacier just 50, 60 years ago. And as the glacier is melted, it left behind bare rock, and you can see what living things are living there now, okay, of flowers and brushes and so forth. We move on to this area. This area was covered by the glacier 100 years ago. And as the glacier melted, it left behind bare rock, and the process of primary succession happened. And you can see how this is a slightly more advanced ecosystem than here, because we've had another 40 years to put more soil into the area. This area right here, this was covered under ice back during the time of the Civil War, the 1860s. So we're looking at 160 years ago. Here, this area that was covered by ice 160 years ago, now we have trees growing there because the soil has gotten thicker and thicker and thicker through the process of primary succession. And then finally here, this area was under the ice almost 300 years ago. The ice melted, pioneer species came in, and eventually a full forest is growing here. So here you can see the process of primary succession as we went to an area with bare rock with almost no soil, making a little bit more soil, a little bit more soil, and finally we have a full-fledged forest there. So that's another example of primary succession at work. So the other example of ecological succession is secondary succession. Now what happens with secondary succession describes how an ecosystem recovers after something came in and killed all the living things, but it left the soil intact. That's secondary succession. So in primary succession, we just had bare rock, and we had to get living things to live there. In secondary succession, all the living things are dead, but the soil is still there, so plants can immediately come in and grow. Now, the classic example of secondary succession is going to be a forest fire. When a forest burns up, all the living things die, and so all the plants are dead, but there's still soil behind. The fire can't destroy the soil. So all we need to do is seeds need to fall in this area, and we can grow whole new plants. In primary succession, we couldn't do that. When you just had bare rock, you couldn't just put seeds on it and expect to get a plant. In secondary succession, the soil is left behind still, and that's the big difference between the two. Another example of secondary succession would be a flood or a tsunami or a hurricane-caused flood. This is a before and after picture of the 2004 tsunami that hit Southeast Asia. This is what the area looked like before. This is what the area looked like after. You can see that all these living things here were wiped out. The 40-foot wave killed all the living things that are in the area, but it left the soil behind. So all that needs to happen is plant new plants, and we can grow a new ecosystem in the area. Another example of secondary succession would be like an asteroid impact. The dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago when a 6-mile wide rock hit the Earth. Picture a rock that stretches from Logan to Smithfield. This rock hit the Earth with more power than all the nuclear weapons man has ever made at the same time, and it hit the Earth here off the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. It made a crater that is 110 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Huge thing. Well, this is what killed off the dinosaurs. It killed off the dinosaurs by putting so much dust in the air that it blocked the sun, and most of the plants died, and the dinosaurs starved to death. Well, this would be an example of secondary succession, because in this area, did we destroy the soil? Sure. But the dinosaurs over here also died, and the plants over here died, even though the soil was not affected. This asteroid did not affect the soil over here. And so that would be another example of secondary succession. So a secondary succession, something comes in, kills off the living things, but the soil is left behind. So what does the process of secondary succession look like? Well, something happens that kills off all the plants. All the living things are wiped out. And it can be a fire, it can be an asteroid, it can be a flood. And so what we're left with is just bare ground. Now this bare ground, all the soil is still there. And so what needs to happen is new plants need to start growing in the area. Now in primary succession, we had no soil. So our first pioneer species was going to be lichen, because that's the only thing that can live in an area where there is no soil. In secondary succession, the soil is still there, and so all that needs to happen is new plants need to come into the area and start to live. And so one difference between primary and secondary succession is primary succession involves lichen as a pioneer species. In secondary succession, we can skip the lichen and the moss phase and get straight to the point where grass is growing in the area. So in secondary succession, your pioneer species is usually a grass, and then things like, flowers and herbs come into the area, and then eventually trees can come in, and then finally we're at our climax community. Now notice the time scale. I told you the primary succession takes hundreds of years. Secondary succession is done in no more than 150 years. So secondary succession happens a lot quicker, and the reason for that is we don't have to make the soil. In primary succession, we have to make soil from scratch. In secondary succession, it's already there. We just got to bring plants into the area to live there. Now, a classic example of secondary succession is Yellowstone National Park, just a few hundred miles away from here. In 1988, Yellowstone National Park almost burnt to the ground. This map over here, you can see the boundaries of Yellowstone Park here in the green, and the yellow, every place that's yellow, this is a place that burnt. 36% of Yellowstone National Park burnt to the ground. The fire was so intense it almost burnt down the lodge at Old Faithful, which some of you guys may have been to. The fire was so intense we couldn't stop it. This fire burnt the whole summer of 1988 and didn't go out until September of 1988 when the rains and the snows came and put it down. We could not stop it. It was a huge, huge, huge fire. And the result of it is lots of Yellowstone National Park looked like this. In September of 1988, huge swaths, every part that's in yellow here of Yellowstone National Park looked like this. So we had a big thing that came in and killed off the living things. Well, this has given us an opportunity to see the process of secondary succession at work. Though what happened is that after the fire, whole areas of the park looked like this. There was nothing living here. All the plants were dead. The fire killed it out. And it was that way over the winter, and then the next spring, this is what we saw. Now, you don't usually see this in Yellowstone because the trees were so thick, the trees blocked all the light and made it so no plants could grow on the floor of the forest. Once the fire came in and killed off all the trees, all these plants had a chance to grow for the first time. So here's our first step in secondary succession. These flowers here would be the pioneer species of Yellowstone after the fire hit. Then, a few years later, we started to see the trees make a rebound. Now you can still see the dead trees here from the fire, and here you can see all the new ones starting to take their place. So the first thing that happened was after the fire, a bunch of grasses and flowers started to grow, and then eventually the trees started to grow, and the trees outcompeted the grasses and the flowers, and started to grow. And then finally, here's a picture I took just a few years ago. This is what Yellowstone looks like today. So you can still see the dead trees from the fire. These are trees that died in the fire, and here we can see the new trees that are starting to take off. Now, the fire happened not even 30 years ago, and Yellowstone hasn't fully recovered, but we can see year by year the process of secondary succession as Yellowstone has recovered from this fire and living things have come back in to live in an area where everything was killed off. This is secondary succession.